So our study unit 2 is on the learning unit, the supply of labor. So under the supply of labor, we have quite a few number of things that we need to look at. We have an introduction. We look at the labor forces, the supply of labor. We look at population and population growth, total fertility rate, impact of HIV and AIDS, immigration, emigration, and migrant labor, as well as there's a 2.8 which talks about a deeper insight from the individual decision to work to the market supply of labor. So I'll start with going over the starter guide. We have a few learning outcomes. We should be able to explain the labor force as the supply of labor, labor force participation rate, population and population growth, total fertility rate, impact of HIV and AIDS, immigration, emigration, and migrant labor, and then there's the theoretical principles underlying the supply of labor market by making use of diagrams. In terms of our introduction, it just talks about a few things, saying why does a person need to actually provide labor to the labor force? Why do we need to start working in the first place? So those are the reasons that we are going to look at in terms of why an individual can decide either to work or not to work more hours or enjoy more leisure hours. That is basically what we are going to look at as the supply of labor. So unlike our goods market, in the labor market, if we have this as I would say on one side, I'll have the price of labor, which is the wage, so that's P, but instead of a price, we call it W. And on the other side, I'll have the quantity, which is the labor that is supplied. So in this instance, individuals become the suppliers of labor. We are the ones who are supplying labor. And the relationship is such that at lower wage rates, people are not induced to work, but people are willing to work when the wages are higher. So at a higher wage rate, like if you're at point A and point B, more people are going to live and want to work at a wage B compared to wage A. There's other various factors that can influence these decisions of an individual. For instance, personal preferences of the individual, amount of money needed, non-labor income, or the wage rate. So that is what we are going to look at, and it's also going to cause shifts and or movements between our curves, depending on what factor is the one that is going to cause the person to start working. Labor forces, the supply of labor. We are going to define terms like what is the labor force, which is also known as the economically active population. And we might as well do that here. So we define it as the total number of people from the working age population, and that is 15 to 64, presenting their labor for remuneration on the labor market, whether employed, self-employed, whether you are an employer or you are unemployed. As long as you are in that age group and you are willing to work, we consider you as part of the labor force. Total labor force is determined by a number of factors, so we have quite a number that we can look at. We can talk about the participation rate, the size of the population, fertility, mortality due to HIV and AIDS in particular, and net migration. Labor force can be derived according to the official, so we have two definitions that we use. Firstly, we have one that we call narrow or strict, and the other one is expanded. In the key difference between the two is what we term as discouraged work seekers. So those are people who are unemployed, but they are not actively seeking employment. So in the narrow definition, if you are unemployed and you are not actively seeking employment, you are not included. So by looking at it, it might look like just a simple thing, simply to take away someone. But if we can think about someone, maybe you are in the rural areas, you don't have access to information, you don't have the internet like everyone takes for granted, you don't have internet, so it means basically you are not informed about job opportunities, job openings, and so on. So the only time that you actually maybe get to go to town is maybe once a month or something like that. So now that means you are not actively looking for a job, but you do need a job. The only time you get to actually maybe send a CV out or apply is that particular time when you go to town or wherever you can get information. So according to the strict definition, anyone such as that, we are not going to include them as unemployed. we are going to deal with only the ones that are actively seeking work. So we are going to deal more with that concept of the discouraged work seeker made later on in Learning Unit 7. So according to States SA, discouraged workers do not form of the part of the labor force according to the street. On the broad, we include them. So that's part of what we are going to deal with, the introducing our labor force participation rate as well as the economically active population. So on the labor force participation rate, which is 2.3, we are talking about the proportion of the total population that works or wants to work. That is going to be the labor force participation rate. Out of the population, how many work and actually want to work. We have different labor force participation rate, like in terms of definitions, but normally we just look at what has happened historically in South Africa over the years. So in South, so far we say labor force participation rate has remained the highest for whites. It has increased rapidly for Africans since 95. It was highest in the 35 to 44 years, followed by those between 25 to 34, 45 to 54, and educational level was close to 90% for those with post-matric qualification. So we need those figures. So on your textbook, you'll find that about labor force participation rate by population group since in 100,000. So we find it around, it's table 2.2, page 15 of the latest edition. So we look at that from 95 all the way until 2016 to say what has participation been like between Africans, coloreds, Indians or Asians, and whites. How has participation changed over time? Population and population growth is one of the chapters that we are going to look at. So we are simply looking at how has population been growing over the past decade or so. And we are going again to split it according to different racial groups as well as to gender, male and female, to see which population has been growing faster, and we try to identify the reasons for that. In 2016, according to our studies, so in 2016, South Africa had a total population of about 56 million people. And we say South Africa's population is about the same as that of Tanzania and Myanmar. It's larger than that of Canada, Australia, and so on. You can go through that. But we say South Africa's population is only about 4% that of China. Africans formed about 81% of total population in 2016. Okay, then an important characteristics of the population is high proportion of young people and the burden on society and the working age population that is caused. This problem likely to be exacerbated by HIV and AIDS, nothing much there. Population growth is determined by three demographic factors, namely fertility, mortality, and migration. So we're still going to look at this in later on. Total fertility, so since we said in terms of the factors that determine population, we have fertility, mortality, and migration. So total fertility rate speaks to fertility. Total fertility rate, again, we define it as the average number of children born alive to a woman in her reproductive years. So that is 15 to 49. There is this whole theory here that you need to go through on your study guide on the total fertility rate, talking about Africans in general and what has been the trend happening in South Africa. So mortality rates have gone down, and women mostly now, the textbook tells us they are not having as many babies as before. So we say here, in South Africa, fertility rate has declined from an estimated 6.7 children per woman in the 60s to about 2.84 according to that study in 2011. So it's from around 7 children to about 3 children now. And we need to understand the reasons why has the total fertility rate decreased. So it's not the same across population groups or different groups that we have. So That is the one that we just looked at, between 6.7 and 2.8 is the average in general. But we do have the ones for Africans and coloreds is still above 2.1. We have the one for whites as well as Indians and Asian. So that is what you need to look at as well, to say what is happening generally between the different population groups. Impact of HIV and AIDS, we know what HIV and AIDS is and what is the impact. So mainly it's going to affect our economically active population, and it reduces it. So by the time the book was written, maybe it was still as bad, but currently it is a bit being managed. So the effects are not as bad as they seem or as they are put across on our textbook. Later on, we go on and look at immigration, emigration, and migrant labor to say how is the economically active population, how is it divided across the different groups. Then towards the end of that section, we said our 2.8 speaks about a deeper insight. So in this, what we say here, it's important that you work through this section very carefully, as there are certain subsections and even past subsections of the prescribed book which are not prescribed for this module and which you therefore do not have to study. So we are going to just browse through that section, and for that we are going to use our slides. So what we need basically is just an understanding of the graphs, how we get our functions, what is involved in our income and labor, utility maximization, and we look at income effect. So that is what we are going to look at in terms of our first section. And then the last section of 2.8 talks about substitution and income effects due to a wage increase. That is our 2.8.